Hello, good morning, good afternoon to our audience joining us from various time zones. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you for making the time to join us for this latest webinar in our Iraq series. Today's program will be dedicated to discussing the findings of a paper recently published by AGSIW visiting fellow Geneive Abdo, titled The Long Game in Iraq, Shia Clerics and Activists Find Common Cause to Confront the States. I will share shortly with you a link to the paper and the chat function. With that, I'll briefly introduce today's panel of experts, starting with the paper's author, Geneive Abdo, visiting fellow at AGSIW and a consultant at the World Bank. She was most recently a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and has worked at several Washington-based think tanks, including the Atlantic Council and the Stimson Center. Her current research focuses on the shifting political and regional alliances within Shia communities in the Middle East. She's the author of numerous publications and books, including The New Sectarianism, The Arab Uprisings, and the Rebirth of the Shia-Sunni Divide. Also with us today, joining us from Baghdad, actually, is Dr. Abbas Kadhim, the director of the Iraq Initiative within the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. Most recently, he was a senior foreign policy fellow at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He also previously held a senior government affairs position at the Iraqi embassy in Washington, D.C. His most recent book is titled Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. Moderating the session today is Ambassador Douglas Silliman, the president of AGSIW. He previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. He also served as a senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. Department of State, working on Iraq issues, and was deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq from 2012 to 2013, minister counselor for political affairs in Baghdad, and deputy chief of mission in Ankara, Turkey from 2008 to 2011. And with that, Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for that introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you might happen to be. I'm very happy to be here today to launch and moderate this discussion on the long game in Iraq, our Shia clerics and activists finding common cause to confront the state, and to work with both Geneive Abdo and Dr. Abbas Kadhim. Thank you all for joining us today. There's a lot going on in Iraq, there always is, but this week has been particularly eventful. If you think about what's happened in just the past week, rockets and drones targeted US and coalition forces. Multiple drones hit a neighborhood in Erbil near the construction site of the new US Consulate General in Erbil. The Hashd al-Shaabi held a major and separate from the rest of the security forces military parade in which they showed tanks, drones, and other heavy weapons. And Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi attended that parade and praised the Hashd for the job that they have been doing. Just a couple of days ago, however, the US military struck Hashd and militia positions in Syria and Lebanon, which they claimed as a launch point for drones against coalition forces and a major logistics base. And Shia militias in Syria yesterday responded by rocketing US military positions in eastern Syria. While all of this is transpiring and as tensions appear to be rising between the Hashd and US forces, politicians and political parties are well into their preparations for parliamentary elections scheduled currently for October. And the reason for these elections was pressure from the massive protests of last year, but the dynamics of the protests, the dynamics of early elections, and the reaction of the Iraqi establishment has changed over the past several months. So with us today to discuss her paper in Iraqi politics as they move toward the elections is Geneive Abdo, as Raymond said, visiting fellow at AGSIW. And we are very honored to have joining us from his temporary perch in Baghdad, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, to discuss the paper and to discuss preparations in Iraqi politics for the next few months. So it's a pleasure to have both of you with us here this morning. Thank you for joining us. Geneive, could you start by describing for us what you found in your research and the kinds of connections that you have seen between the ideas of the protesters, the ideas of prominent Iraqi clerics, and what they had hoped to accomplish from the protest movement?
Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Doug, and for your support and input into my research. And I'd also, of course, like to thank Abbas who is an esteemed scholar of Iraqi politics and Shia theology. And in fact, Abbas was very instrumental in helping me receive my first invitation many years ago to Najaf. So he, in many ways, was very instrumental in me even starting research about Iraq and the clerics in Iraq. So as Doug mentioned, I mean, I think that the reason I wrote the paper for many reasons was to try to delve into the less obvious dynamics and aspects of the protest movement. The research was conducted based upon Arabic research, academic research, social media in Arabic, and interviews inside Iraq. And so, as you know, we know from the protest movement, of course, it began in October 2019. And I think, again, what's different is that we've seen other waves of protest in Iraq, 2015 and so forth. But this was undoubtedly the most formidable challenge to the state since 2003. And it has other unusual characteristics which are worth noting. It's comprised of mostly young Shia demonstrators, and they are protesting against a Shia-led state. And this is the first time we've really seen this in the Arab world. The youth that are demonstrating represent a new demographic. While they define themselves as secular leaning, they also used, to some degree, religious Shia symbolism in the protests. They often waved flags and banners of Imam Hussein and so forth. So that's one complexity of the protest movement, one characteristic that I tried to describe and analyze in the paper. They also represent the demands of much of the population. That according to polling that's been conducted over the last several years. And they, you know, are basically calling, like most Iraqis, for a total overhaul of the political system. They're calling for economic reform, of course, basic services, and an end to Iranian meddling, which is a very important factor, and I'll speak a bit about that later. These are their long-term goals. So these were the long-term goals that they set out at the beginning very clearly. And their short-term goal is that they hoped to somehow reform the political process and participate in the political process in this election, which Doug talked about, which is scheduled at least for October. I think that my conclusions from the paper, which I'll discuss a bit in detail later, are basically that while I think they've changed, they are a game changer in terms of long-term Iraqi politics. But in the short term, I don't believe that they will have an effect on the election. So anybody looking toward the election to sort of fundamental change, bring about fundamental change, I don't think that's going to happen. So in that sense, that we could say that they're successful to some degree, but their more immediate goal probably will not materialize. In the first-hand accounts from the young Shia who were interviewed for the paper, the demonstrators, you know, we asked them, you know, what are their reasons for being on the street? And, you know, the clear answer was a great sense of anger at the Shia-dominated state. And they really believed that the state should provide a much better life for them than that of their parents. They also want an end to the sectarian and ethnic-based power-sharing system, and they want its replacement to be a civic state. They believe that prioritizing sectarian interests has only led to ineffective governance. And in addition, they want, you know, they see that a system that was designed in 2003 to benefit all Shias has not really happened. And in fact, as we look at this 20 years later, reducing politics to religion and identity has produced an Iraqi state of patronage politics and cronyism toward the very sect that the system was supposed to help in a post-Saddam era. For example, I won't get into these statistics, they're in the paper, but some of them come from the World Bank. For example, despite the dominance of Shia elites in government, the highest poverty headcounts in Iraq have been recorded in mainly Shia areas. So you can see that they have very concrete grievances. So this new chapter, I think, in Iraqi history could be an indication that perhaps the years of sectarian-based violence between Sunni and Shia are on the decline. But the fear is that the era now is being replaced by an internal Shia conflict. And as we were discussing, the three of us yesterday, without doubt, the Shia conflict is the central sort of conflict in Iraqi politics today. I think that as the protesters have challenged the state, what has fueled, I think, both their errors and also their anger has certainly been the violence committed against them by both the Iranian-backed Shia militias and also to some degree by the Iraqi state security forces. So they have been killing the demonstrators. Kidnappings have occurred, and those killings continue. I think the estimate at this point is that more than 700 protesters have been killed to date since 2019. So the violence that was being committed, particularly in the early months in 2019 and early 2020, compelled the clerics to become involved and to be very vocal publicly about their support for the demonstrators' right to voice their, voice free expression, to voice their grievances against the state. And I think that while, of course, the traditional role of the Margia, the clerics in Iraq, has been to safeguard society and to create stability, I think this time the support that has been demonstrated is a bit different. There's been direct involvement. I mean, in the early months of the protests, Ayatollah Sistani made it very clear that he was supporting the movement. After some sort of delay or ambiguity, I think that he felt that in the first few weeks, it was unclear what position he would take. But then by November 2019, he was clearly supporting the protest movement because he could see sort of the pulse of the street. And other clerics also became very involved, lower ranking clerics. And it's not to go without notice that clerical involvement was at least partially responsible for the removal of power of the former Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi. That was the first demand of the demonstrators. It was a huge win for them. They managed to basically depose a prime minister in the early months of the protests. So part of the interviews that were done for the paper were with these lower ranking clerics to ask them, why are they supporting the demonstrators? Why are they, some of them actually protested with the demonstrators, so you could see them physically on the streets of Iraq demonstrating. And I thought that this was an important point to write about in the paper, because I don't think that we have seen an example of the last decade of direct clerical participation in a civil society protest movement aside from Egypt, where we saw both during the ousting of former President Mubarak and then the counter-revolution, we saw sheikhs from Al-Azhar actually on the streets with the demonstrators. And this is what we have witnessed to some degree in Iraq. So the obvious question is, why did Iraq's Margia publicly side with the protest movement? And based on these interviews for the paper, I think that, some reasons are that they participated or altruistic, while others are more cynical. As it goes without saying, Ayatollah Sistani has intervened directly in Iraqi politics in very significant ways since 2003. The most significant fatwa he issued, of course, was in 2014 when he called upon all Iraqis, not just Shia, to take arms against the Islamic State. So there's certainly precedent for this over the centuries of political involvement by the clerics. One of the interviews that was conducted for the paper was with Saeed Amar al-Hakim. He's a powerful Iraqi cleric who led the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq from 2009 to 2017. And he said that the reason he is supporting the demonstrations, and again, this is a more sort of rosy picture of things, but was that he believed that they articulated the demands of the Margia for reform in Iraq over the last decade. So he felt that there was a a definite compatibility between the demonstrators' demands and what the clerics want for an Iraqi state. And, obviously, this is what this conflict and the competition is about, is what should an Iraqi state be? What should an Iraqi state look like? And I think that one of the downsides of the movement, of course, like many opposition movements, is they can clearly articulate their grievances, but there has not been really a program for the future. So for the protesters, I think that even though they have declared they want a secular state, in the same interviews that they denounced the Margia, they also said that they welcome their support. So I found this to be obviously a bit of a complication, but I think that they have very mixed views. They want a secular state. They believe that the Margia are an obstacle to real reform in Iraq, but at the same time, many of them believed that having the clerics on their side, having them support their movement, was a plus against the state, particularly because their ultimate opponent, the Shia militias, was their opposition was insurmountable. So you have this unspoken alliance between civil society and the Margia. Where did it lead now that we are 2 years later from the beginning of the protests? I think that we've certainly seen a decline in the numbers of protesters on the streets. And since Abbas is there in Baghdad now, perhaps he can shed light on this. The targeted killings have continued, and the Iranian-backed Shia militias, the Hashid, as Doug pointed out earlier, I think seem more powerful today than they were in 2019. We see widespread support within the general population for reform and an end to the corrupt political system, which translates, of course, ultimately in the long term, more support for the demonstration movement. But we also see that the protest movement will likely fail to achieve its immediate goal, which is some sort of change that will result from the October elections. Some of the leaders of the movement have moved their protests from the street to the formalized political sphere. They're running in elections, they form political parties. A few have also joined existing political coalitions, such as that of Amr al-Hakim. And I think, though, that the most they can hope for is to win only a few seats, if that many, in the elections. And I think that, unfortunately, the electoral system, whereby the popular election results almost become irrelevant after the election is held, remains in place. So on those grounds, they have not really achieved their objectives. And when we were speaking yesterday, just to describe for those of you who aren't familiar with how the electoral system works in Iraq, when we were speaking, the three of us yesterday, Abbas described the period after the election as the time when what he called the negotiators meet to agree on a government. And I think that that's a very precise way to describe how elections are run. So there's a popular vote, and then there are backroom deals conducted for months and months and months after the election is held to decide the formation of the government, particularly who will be the prime minister. And this is the system, of course, that the protesters and many Iraqis oppose. So knowing that the electoral outcome will not be as they had hoped, but many protest leaders now are calling for a boycott of the elections. And I think that although this will surely be a black mark on the state, if we look to 2018 as an example, it's highly unlikely to really fundamentally change the system. In 2018, the formal figure from the state was that 44% of the electorate voted, but the real number is somewhere around 20%. So obviously, this is a bit, it certainly does not give the state much legitimacy. Yet we have seen that since 2018, there have been ups and downs, there have been a lot of crises, but the state continues to function. So in conclusion, I think there are a few takeaways, which are in my paper from the sort of this era of a very, very relevant and important protest movement. I believe it has brought about an irreversible shift in Iraq, a long-term shift It has changed the political landscape for the long term, even if the status quo is preserved in the October elections. And it has given a boost to the Margia for now, even if they, in the long term, continue to be irrelevant, as has been indicated by the polling data. And finally, we can talk about this more in the Q&A. I think that the movement has shown that Arab Shia want Iraq out of their countries. The part of the movement opposing Iran's meddling has gained support in countries such as Bahrain and Lebanon. And I know that for those European countries and for the United States that are now negotiating with Iran, I think that this opens an opportunity for Western governments to try to engage Arab Shia populations, because I think that based on media sort of narratives and stereotypes, we tend to think of the Shia in general as adherents to Iran and Iran's system of Velayat Faqih. And I think that the Iraqi example shows us that that's definitely no longer true. So that's, I'd like to conclude there, and I look forward to Abbas's remarks and response. Thank you.
Geneive, thank you very much for that excellent summary. Abbas, I'd like to turn to you for your thoughts on Geneive's paper, but also on the impact of the protests and what the position of the Margia and other prominent Shia clerics has been on elections and on the protests. So please, Abbas.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Silliman, for the invitation, and to Raymond as well. And I would like to thank Geneva for an excellent paper. Geneva wrote this paper with two credibilities. One is that she is Geneva, who writes a good paper always when she writes about the Middle East, and she does her homework very well, and she doesn't leave a stone unturned. She also comes with the credibility of doing the work in the field in Iraq, speaking to people on the street, and not just speculating from thousands of miles away. And that's a great advantage to do that, is basically getting the information right from the source. And that shows in the paper. Now, one can maybe wrestle with some of the ideas, the proposals and the paper, some of the descriptions and the narratives, but these are only secondary to what I just said. It's a great paper, and it's very informative, and we see some good insights in it for those who are watching Iraq and trying to understand this dynamic of a relation that is not, as Geneva says, it's not an intuitively understood relation between a movement that is young, that is secular, that is probably has grievances that are voiced against the role of religion in the state affairs, and also the main target of the grievances were parties and leaders who are, for right or wrong, affiliated with or associated with religious labels. Then they would just have that alliance between this kind of audience or this kind of group with the very representatives of the religious spiritual leadership in Iraq. And there is a lot of nuance also to be made in addition to what Geneva has done an excellent job in making. But I would like to sort of take us back a little bit to the movement and how it started and how it progressed and where we are today. And I was in Baghdad when the movement started, when demonstrations were always there. It wasn't new in 2019, but I was in Baghdad in the middle of 2019 and from September and through the beginning of October when it all started. And initially, I think it was just going to be just another wave of protests, summer protests, people who were angry, trying to ask for better services, better employment, etc. And I think what made it different was the fact that that time in October of 2019, there were fatalities. People were killed on the streets, as they were. Normally, the government met the protesters with the normal policing, anti-riot kind of tactics, and things continued and they coexisted with the protesters, but killing people on the streets day after day, and the toll was rising. That did a couple of things. One of them, it created or generated a lot of sympathy towards the protesters, and also it mobilized more people. And normally, with this kind of emotional moment, emotional atmosphere, it was a big movement. And then all of a sudden, the storm was gathering bigger and bigger support and bigger impact. And we started seeing the protesters upping or raising the ceiling of their demands as casualties continued to fall. And sooner we started seeing that the demands were moving towards wanting to topple the government, or that the government should resign. And when the government resigned, there was a huge momentum. It was the thrill of success that they've accomplished something that was a first. No government before in the post-2003, or even prior to 2003, for that matter, that resigned under popular pressure since the 1940s, when there was a monarchy and a constitutional government. This accomplishment by itself and the pressure that was mounting forced the political leaders to comply with the demands. We started seeing a new elections law being introduced. We started seeing, of course, the government resigned. We started seeing a race among all of the political parties and leaders to show themselves in support of this movement and actually implementing the demands, or trying to implement them. And change was coming fast, and hopes were rising, not just among the protesters, but among the rest of Iraq and the Iraqis who were looking for these demands to be realized. Two things happened that sucked the oxygen from this movement. When there was a 24-hour, 7 days a week coverage of the protesters, TV cameras are always on the protesters. The unanticipated sudden showdown between the United States and Iran and pro-Iran militant groups that happened in late December brought to the scene a more newsworthy event, if you will, and screens started to split. And the protesters were having now half of the screen, the less exciting half, and all of a sudden the events were moving and the analyses were moving towards this new crisis that was in the making. By January 3rd, and with the killing of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, basically the protesters were all forgotten, and people were focusing on this real crisis. And then the second event that sucked the rest of the oxygen was COVID-19 that came, and then of course people could not be in the streets en masse, and ultimately the protests were suffering and a great deal, and their momentum went down. So that said, the accomplishment should not be underestimated. You started seeing real changes were happening, but as I said, when we had less impact, less interest in the protests, and more interest in the economic crisis, which is the third blow that hit the Iraqi society, and then with oil prices going to close to zero, and then the COVID and the aftermath of the U.S.-Iranian showdown. We saw the 3 attempts to form a government. Political parties almost recovered from a strong blow, and they went and did their negotiation in a worse style than what used to be done in the post-2003. I would argue that the times when they were trying to form a government of Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi, then Adnan Zurfi, then even the government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi, it came back to a sectarian, ethno-sectarian apportionment in the ugliest form of it, as if there were no protesters. And again, that's because the protesters lost their upper hand because of COVID and what happened as I described. Now, to the point of the paper, what got the clergy and the Margia to interfere? First, because the Margia has always interfered in crises like this. The Margia has a long history from the predating the Iraqi state, and even from the formation years of the Iraqi state in the 1920s, and throughout the history of the 20th century and the 21st century. They always have been there. And this was a crisis of a great magnitude. And the Margia had to interfere. Also, it is not just the Margia, but as Geneva describes, that those who entered into the alliance with the protesters are not just the inner circle of the Margia, but there are clergy who are in the larger context of the religious and the spiritual establishment in Iraq, the Shia side at least, because clerics and religion or religious scholars are not just people of an institution. There is not really a strong sense of an institution in the Shia Margia, but they are also individuals in the society. These people have their own interests and their own political preferences and also their own political affiliations in many cases. There are many people who wear the cleric attire, who are religious scholars, but they in fact are activists of their own way, and they are investing their time and energy and hearts in the social and political affairs of the country. And that also is a factor, and they have always been in this. Also, the fact that these protesters are advancing secular demands, we should not also forget or leave out the fact that they are also members of a society who have religious affiliations. They are Shia. Some of them are practicing Shia in a very strong way, and then they look up to the Margia for spiritual issues. Some of those protesters are the same people who picked up arms and went to heed Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Sistani's fatwa to fight ISIS. So this natural affiliation between the clergy and the Shia Margia with the youth in Iraq is really something that is not way out of the expected. They do want to have a secular Iraq, a professional government, a better governance. They also brought a new phenomenon in the Iraqi politics, which is really, they raised the level of Iraqi patriotism and Iraqi nationalism. Iraqi flag was raised more than any time in the past, and as Geneva just was describing. So in terms of trying to get Iraq or defend Iraqi sovereignty and meddling of foreign countries in Iraq, these are all products of the protest time. So I believe that the Margia, while Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani and his representatives do support the protesters, and they have lent them their moral guidance and moral support. It was not just because the protesters were asking the Margia and many of their chantings to interfere, but also I think it is the Margia itself senses that it is partly at least responsible for what goes on in Iraq. From the beginning in the post-2003 foundation of the new republic, they have supported certain sides that and they have guided people towards certain political practices that put us where we are today, and unintentionally, but no matter what, this is part of what the fix we are in is because of certain positions from the clerical side. But also, I think the Margia would not be silent when they see blood being spilled on the streets, and that is normally very much anticipated. This is the history of the Margia. So it is important to understand this context, that this is the Margia is not just a religious, a pure theological or jurisprudential entity. It is also a social, a leading social institution, an indigenous institution that never ceased to exist in Iraq and never ceased to exert influence. Will it be able to lead this movement to any fruition in the coming elections? Yesterday we did discuss this briefing, and I look forward also to discussing it today. Basically, my calculation is that it is too soon for this movement, with or without the Margia alliance, to compete seriously with entrenched, established political blocs, because the time between the protests start and then the election is just too short to mature a political bloc that is seriously competing and gaining significant number of seats. And also even the time between the protests beginning and until today was not a normal time for political work. It was time of one crisis after another, and also the social and health challenges with the epidemic. So this is all not a normal environment where you could anticipate a movement like this to work. I think the greatest danger of or the greatest enemy of this protest movement is if it goes into a mode of despair or lack of hope, or lack of understanding of the nature of politics in a fledgling democracy. They might not accomplish much in the calculation or the math of how many seats gained, but they have accomplished a lot to keep them going forward for the 2026 election, or 2025 elections, if we are going to have the elections now, or depends on how the Iraq will decide when the next election will be, and going forward as well. This needs to be a movement that is durable, that has a long-term agenda, while it is fighting on the tactics of today's politics. I will stop here again and reiterate my admiration of this paper and the contributions that it is making to our understanding of this topic.
Abbas, thank you very much for your comments. And since we have relatively limited time, I want to jump into a couple of questions. I mean, one from Raymond Termini is really trying to set a baseline. He asks, essentially, what is the ethnic sectarian breakdown of the voting age population in Iraq? And are the protesters old enough to vote? So I want to turn that into two questions. First, to answer, I mean, my best recollection of old CIA statistics is Shia make up about 65% of the population, Arab Sunnis about 20% of the population, Kurds, mostly Sunni, between 12 and 15% of the population, and the balance is Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities. with the caveat that this is very old information. There has not been an accurate census in decades, and it may not be as bad a breakdown as Lebanon. But the other question, I get the impression that the Shia population is likely to rise a bit as a percentage of the population. The population growth is higher. I just don't know how that translates into voting age population. But I'll ask maybe Abbas to start. Does it even matter what the age is? Because I know that both you and Geneive have mentioned that the protest movements have now begun to ask some of their supporters not to vote in the elections. So is this a significant outcome, and what will be the result of some supporters of the protest going into politics and others asking their followers to stay out of politics?
Well, this is a good question. Of course, the last credible election, census Iraq has had was the 1957. Yes, it is better than Lebanon's 1932 census. Iraq needs another census badly in order to really get its act together. There was supposed to be one in 2020, but the pandemic did not allow for it. But I think one thing is important is that Iraq is a young population. 40% of Iraqis, according to the government statistics, are under 14. About 60% are under 25. So this is, the protesters and the people that are like-minded in the country are the vast majority of the country. I don't think that it matters the political, the sectarian affiliation. Iraqi youth are pretty much past the sectarianism that has affected or shaped earlier generations. But I believe that I think now they are coming out of or they are trying to boycott the election or not to participate. As you said, it will make this question probably moot. But I believe that, again, if they decide last minute that they will participate, Iraq's voting age is 18. A lot of the participants will not be part of this age. We've seen a lot of people who are 17, 16, 15, and even 14 years old. But I believe that the protesters have managed to create a general perception and a general attitude towards the elections and towards the political parties that infected, if you will, or was contagious to the rest of society. So the younger ones might not be voting, but their families or members of their families are. And I think many people who sympathize with them are going to vote their way.
And Geneive, I want to bundle a couple of questions that we have together and pose them to you and see what you think the future holds based on your research and interviews. The first question from James Downer is essentially, what is the likely glide path to change in the future? Both you and Abbas have suggested people coming out of the protest movement may win a seat or two or three in the Council of Representatives in October, but what is the pathway forward? And Vince Campos essentially asks, will more people be added to the ranks of protest supporters or people who support the ideology of the protest in the future, especially since Iraqis are so young? Many of the protesters may not yet be of voting age. And maybe underneath all of this, is democracy and the need to go and vote something that is yet understood in Iraqi youth and Iraqi politics, outside of those who have organized political parties? So a lot of disparate questions in there, but what do you see in the future coming out of the protest is the simple question.
Well, I think that, like a lot of Arab countries, the demographics point to change. If we consider, as Abbas said, that 60% of the population now today is under 25 years old. As we move forward, of course, the demographics will change, I think, in the favor of reform. There are huge obstacles, as we've laid out. Will the coalitions that exist now, for example, and the alliances, will they shift? Probably not anytime in the future. I mean, we're seeing it in the run-up to the election that, Amr al-Hakim now is aligned with somebody else. We don't really know, for example, who Muqtada Sadr will align with. In 2018, he did get some support from the Communist Party, which was a bit unusual. So there do tend to be unusual coalitions that develop in the run-up to elections. But those coalitions, no matter how they shift, are still within the same sort of patronage system that exists today. So there would have to be an ultimate sort of overhaul, I think, of the electoral system. And that's something that the protesters did call for. They called for electoral reform, and a new law was passed. But the law doesn't fundamentally change, for example, the ability of independence or the ability to include the parties and the coalitions who are now outside the system. So the electoral law that was passed is sort of one step in the right direction, but it's not enough. And it's not enough to change the outcome of the election. And I think that, I tend to be, and I think certainly, EU member states are hopeful that change is coming. And I think that we see that in the investment that's coming to Iraq now by some of the EU member states. I think that we see that even in the communique that the G7 issued just a few weeks ago. Yes, okay, you can say this is just sort of a Pollyannish kind of mentality, but I think that there is a sense, and I don't know if I think it's too early to know if it's real or not. There is a sense, I think, within the international community that we're at a different place now in Iraq. And I think that's important. And I think the final thing I'd like to say is that we have seen that the young generation wants international involvement. They don't want military international involvement. They want international involvement in a positive way. And this is why the demonstrators wanted the UN to monitor the elections. And that's something that's happening. So I think that in the long term, I see a positive result, even though there are obviously going to be a lot of obstacles along the way. And, obviously, Iran's involvement in Iraq is a big factor in sort of the path forward.
Let me ask a question of my own and then bring in a question from Robert Friedman about that very point, Geneive, about Iranian influence. And maybe Abbas, will start with you, but Geneive, I'll ask you to respond as well. What has been the reaction of the rest of Iraq, non-Shia Iraq, to these protests? Again, I have heard in talking to my Iraqi friends over the past couple of years, generalized support from Kurds, generalized support from Sunni Arabs, and a lot of emotional involvement from Shia Arab Iraqis. How has the rest of Iraq seen this, and has Iraqi politics truly become only a dialogue among Shia factions and among institutionalized Shia political powers? And in step with that, the question from Robert Friedman, how can Iranian influence in Iraq be reduced? And is this something that the protesters are actually seeking, as Geneive, you implied? Or is this not any longer a major faction or major factor in the ideology of the protesters? So Abbas, I'll start with you, and then we can go to Geneive as well.
I think the protesters are not only Shia, as you well know. They are drawn from society at large, and there are all shades of Iraqi demographics are in the protests. Also the support that came to them, at least the moral support, has come from all parts of Iraq. But there are limitations on the certain demographics and geographical places in Iraq. The Sunni land and Sunni provinces right now are trying to cope with the aftermath of the ISIS war that destroyed their provinces and left many of them IDPs. Kurdistan, by design and by action has been actually separated from the rest of Iraq. And first it is far away from the center of the protests, Baghdad, but also by the way that Kurdistan is set up. There is very limited interaction and many barriers between the people of Kurdistan. But there are also many Kurds in the rest of Iraq that are living and participating, and some of them are even in the protests. The question on Iran, the best way to limit Iranian interference is to strengthen the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government is vulnerable. The Iraqi government is dependent in many aspects of its day-to-day life on outside help and support, and that's why Iran interferes a lot. The Iranians interfere more, or probably even they are perceived to interfere more first because there is too much complaint about Iranian in the media and elsewhere. But in fact, the Iranian interference is no more than other interferences. We see everybody has sticking a finger into the Iraqi affairs one way or another. Now, what is interesting, and here is we have to speak frankly, if other people also work to close the door for interference, there will be less room for Iran to interfere. But everybody wants the door to be open so they can interfere. But when Iran uses that little gap to enter in, people complain. I think we need to close the interference door for everybody, and this way, and we try to support and strengthen the hand of the government, the Iraqi government, meet the demands. But it is very complex. The Iranians have been working in Iraq almost unopposed since 2003. Mainly because of the reluctance of the other neighbors and to embrace Iraq and to work with the Iraqis. And also, again, Iran has structural affinities with Iraq and the new Iraqi leadership complex that dates back to the 1970s and 80s. So it is. This is a very hard nut to crack, and I think we will have to deal with Iranian interference and meddling. And the best thing we hope is to reduce it to a manageable level. Right now, it's out of control.
Geneive, any thoughts from you?
I think that, I totally agree that the way to address Iranian interference is to strengthen the Iraqi state. That's definitely true on an economic level, military issues aside. I do think, though, if you look at this from the Iranian perspective, and I lived for 3 years in Iran when I was a correspondent, so I'm sort of familiar with the objectives, at least the regional objectives of an Iranian state, because they're pretty consistent, they don't change. And I think if you look at it from the Iranian state perspective, it doesn't look good for the Iraqis. We talk about Iran, but in fact, there are many Iranian states, and the most active part of the state that is in Iraq are the Revolutionary Guards and the Al-Quds Force. So they have their own agenda. So I think that, as Abbas said, this is a huge problem. And even if there is the Iraqi state is strengthened economically, for example, even if Iraq has other sources for energy and natural gas other than Iran, which will be a very positive development, and that's moving forward. I think that we have to consider the military aspect is a really hard nut to crack, because the Revolutionary Guards have their own agenda for Iraq, unfortunately.
Abbas, I've got an interesting question from Yasser Maliki, essentially saying it has been clear based on the Margia's insistence on fair and free and monitored elections that Ayatollah Ali Sistani and the Margia supports the ideas of the protest movement. The question is going to be, do you see that the passing of Ayatollah Sistani, when that eventually happens, will have any impact, either weakening or strengthening the ideas of the protest movement?
Well, I have written in many occasions on the dreadful event of, that we all hope that it will never come soon, of passing of Grand Ayatollah Sistani. This will leave a gap that will not be filled by anybody and anything, and it will take probably over a decade for someone to reach the spiritual and social and political credibility of the role of the Margia under Ali Sistani. So I would just put it in a very short phrase: nothing can be good that can come after the passing of Ali Sistani. It will not help anything. It will only hurt 360 degrees. So we hope that Iraqis, the political class, and also society, to start preparing for that. He's over 90 now, and I think until now, people are just, the moment they hear of this prospect, they just become paralyzed and stop thinking. We need to start thinking of how to prepare for that day when it comes. Again, I hope that it will not come soon.
Thank you, Abbas. I'm afraid we are nearly out of time. So, Geneive, I'm going to give you the last question, which is a very pragmatic one, and one that I think you can answer well based on your discussions with some of the people in the protest movement. It's from Neil van der Linden in the Netherlands, asking, he has contacts with some very enthusiastic young Iraqis. What is it that Western countries, Western embassies might be able to do to support or encourage young Iraqis? And indeed, can they do this without also being accused of interference in Iraqi affairs, the way that others are interfering, accusing Iran of interfering? So is there a role for Western countries, Western embassies in supporting, educating protesters? And if so, what do you think might be a practical way forward?
Well, I think that's always the dilemma, right? For the United States, for the international community. If they endorse opposition movements, then it becomes a kiss of death. It becomes part of the internal politics, the internal dynamics between the opposition and the state. So I don't think that, speeches of endorsement of the protesters are really an effective way for either Europe or the United States to support the movement. And I don't think that the protesters even want that kind of support, again, because it's sort of the kiss of death. I think rather, rather than support the protest movement, I think the wiser approach is to support their objectives. How do we get there? How do we get a more stable Iraqi state? How do we get an Iraqi state that's less economically dependent upon Iran? So I think that's the way to help the protesters, and I think that they would support that kind of help. They certainly don't want any endorsements from foreign governments.
So we've run out of time, but let me give each of you a minute or two to summarize or make any last comments you would like. Abbas, is there anything you'd like to add at the end of our program?
Well, thank you very much. I believe that what we need right now is to have international pressure to make sure that elections are held, and that elections are held transparently and with credible level of standards. I am glad to see that the UN is going to be involved, but also we need to help the Iraqi state. Right now, we have a government that is pragmatic, that is that listens, and it still has all kinds of problems. But I think we are at a good juncture here where we could see international help coming to Iraq. That security is behind us, mostly with terrorism and all of that. We need to try to bring as much international help to Iraq as possible to continue and finish the business of building the state.
Abbas, thank you. Geneive, your final thoughts?
I don't really have anything to add. I agree completely. And I do think that, as I mentioned before, that the international attitude is that it's hopeful, that, I think that most countries believe that Iraq is in a different place now. And despite all the pessimism that we expressed over the last hour, and the obstacles. I think that that's true in the long term.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, just as we're beginning the discussion of Iraqi politics, we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank all of you in the audience for spending a part of your day today. We know you have a lot to do, and we appreciate the fact that you were here with us. This program has been recorded. It will be available on the AGSIW website, www.agsiw.org, in the next day or two, where you will also find lots of other good programs on Iraq, on Iran, on the Gulf, on politics, economics, society, culture, a lot of issues that are relevant to the way that people live their lives. So thank you for attending today. I wish you all a good day.